When we think of American history, we often imagine the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock, the Founding Fathers drafting the Constitution, or the westward expansion of settlers. But what if I told you there's an entire chapter missing from this story? For centuries, the lands we now call the United States were shaped by Spanish speaking explorers, settlers, and revolutionaries, as well as indigenous nations. From Florida to California, from Texas to New Mexico, Hispanic culture and influence were not just present, they were foundational. Most people believe that the first European settlement in North America was at Jamestown, Virginia. But long before the English set foot there, the Spanish had already established St. Augustine in Florida, founded in 1565. It remains the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the United States. The Spanish influence didn't stop there. Missions, presidios, and towns were established across the continent, stretching from Florida to California, and even deep into the American Southwest. The American Southwest was once, at least in name, part of a vast Spanish empire known as El Norte. Before the United States even existed, the Spanish had already mapped the Mississippi River, named places like Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Santa Fe, and built roads like El Camino Real, the Royal Road that connected Mexico City to Texas and California. Unlike the Spanish heartlands of Mexico and Peru, El Norte was never fully conquered, however. The rugged landscapes of the American Southwest, combined with powerful indigenous nations like the Comanche, Apache, and the Pueblo people, prevented Spain from imposing complete control. Indigenous resistance was fierce, shaping the region's political and economic dynamics and bending the colonizers to their will. Rather than enforcing rigid colonial rule, the Spanish in El Norte were forced to adopt, intermarry with indigenous communities, and create a unique mestizo culture that blurred the lines between conqueror and native. This ever-shifting balance of power made El Norte fundamentally different from other colonial regions. It was never fully subdued, and its people never fully colonized. Instead, they built a world where cultures merged rather than one where an empire dominated. Nowhere was this resistance more evident than in Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonization in North America. After decades of Spanish rule, forced labor, and religious oppression, led by the Tewa spiritual leader Pope, launched a coordinated rebellion to reclaim sovereignty over their lands. This uprising wasn't just a moment of defiance, it was a declaration that El Norte would never be fully colonized. Pueblo warriors attacked Spanish settlements, destroyed missions, and drove the Spaniards out of Santa Fe, forcing them to retreat to El Paso. Indigenous resistance in the borderlands shaped later struggles for autonomy across the region and continues to do so today. Though the Spanish eventually returned in 1692, they were forced to adopt a more conciliatory approach, allowing Pueblo people to retain aspects of their culture and governance. The Pueblo Revolt proved that El Norte remained a land where the conquest was never absolute, where indigenous power endured, and where colonial rule was always contested. But this history is often overlooked, and the reason may not be as simple as we think. It's not just because the narrative of American history has long focused on the British colonies. Because without El Norte, the United States, as we know it, might never have existed. This is especially important in today's climate as the emerging fascist order continues to not just erase this legacy from history, but completely dehumanize the people who have built and lived in the Southwest for generations. As I mentioned, unlike the attitude of the English, it's impossible to distinguish the descendants of colonists and indigenous people in this region, making the so-called Latinos indigenous to the land. Throughout the 19th century, Mexico became a refuge for enslaved people escaping the United States. Unlike the US, which maintained slavery in the South until 1865, Mexico abolished slavery in 1829 under President Vicente Guerrero, a man of Afro-Indigenous descent. This abolition, combined with Mexico's opposition to US expansionism, made the country a sanctuary for freedom seekers. Many enslaved people fled south across the Rio Grande, particularly into Texas, when it was still part of Mexico. Rather than being captured and returned, as was common in the US, escapees were often welcomed, granted land, and even allowed to integrate into Mexican society. Some joined black and indigenous communities, while others worked as farmers, craftsmen, or soldiers in the Mexican army. This policy of refuge enraged slaveholders in Texas, who saw Mexico as a direct threat to their economic system. In fact, Mexico's anti-slavery stance was one of the reasons Texas rebelled and declared independence in 1836. Even after Texas joined the U.S., Mexico remained a haven for escapees, reinforcing the idea that El Norte was a contested space where freedom and oppression clashed at the borders. Now let's go back to the history. In the 19th century, the balance of power shifted. The United States expanded westward, often at the expense of Spanish-speaking communities as well as indigenous nations. Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico were once part of Mexico before being annexed by the U.S. after the Mexican-American War. Hispanic communities that had lived in these lands for generations were suddenly treated as foreigners in their own homes. Despite promises of citizenship and rights, many faced discrimination and violence while contributing to most of the labor. Many were deported. An interesting story from the Mexican-American War is that of the Irish St. Patrick's Battalion, who deserted the U.S. Army due to anti-Catholic discrimination and harsh treatments. They had brought with themselves anti-colonial ideas as a result of their struggle against the British Empire. Led by John Riley, they joined Mexico, drawn by shared faith and better opportunities. They fought fiercely, especially at Churubusco, where they earned both admiration and fear. However, after their capture, many were executed by hanging, while others faced brutal punishments like flogging and branding. Today, they're honored in Mexico as heroes, as their descendants still live in the area. The history of El Norte isn't about colonial Spain. It's about the people who labored, resisted, and shaped the modern borderlands. This is where the Brown Belt comes in. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican workers were the backbone of American industries, building railroads, mining, and working on vast agricultural lands in the Southwest. These workers were part of a transnational labor force. The industrial expansion of the Brown Belt relied not only on Mexican laborers, but also on Chinese workers, who often faced brutal exploitation and racial violence. Despite this, they built thriving communities, blending Chinese and Mexican cultures in ways that defied rigid racial boundaries of the region. Chinese immigrants faced intense discrimination and exclusion in the U.S., particularly after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred their entry and denied them citizenship. As racism and violence against Chinese communities escalated, especially in the American West, many were forcibly expelled from cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. These were the very people who had built the railway and the American West. Some even faced violent mob attacks as a thank you for their hard work. Seeking refuge, thousands crossed into Mexico, where the government, eager to modernize and expand its economy, welcomed them as laborers and entrepreneurs. Unlike in the US, Mexico did not initially enforce exclusion laws, allowing Chinese immigrants to establish businesses, integrate with local communities, and even intermarry with Mexicans. Cities like Mexicali, Sonora became hubs of Chinese-Mexican culture, with a fusion of traditions that persists today. However, this acceptance was short-lived. During the 1930s, a rise in nationalist and anti-Chinese sentiment led to forced deportations and massacres, particularly in Sonora and Torreon. Despite this, many Chinese Mexicans persevered, and their contributions remained embedded in the economic and cultural fabric of the Brown Belt, a testament to their resilience in a world that tried to erase them. At the turn of the 19th century, as it is today, the movement of Mexican workers was more than just economic migration. It was a political force. The injustices faced by these workers ignited radical movements, fueling the Mexican Revolution of 1910. The Magonistas were a group of revolutionaries led by Ricardo Flores Magón. They used the United States as a base to challenge Porfirio Díaz's dictatorship in Mexico. It is also interesting to point out that many of the U.S. federal law enforcement agencies were actually founded during this time to crack down on Mexican revolutionaries. These revolutionaries, often called bad Mexican by U.S. authorities, were fighting not just for Mexican freedom, but for workers' rights and social justice on both sides of the borders. They also had very strong alliances with American and Mexican labor unions. So as we see, the Brown Belt wasn't just a site of exploitation, it was a hotbed of resistance. The labor movements born in this era helped shape labor rights across the U.S. and fueled the Mexican Revolution, forever altering the political landscape of North America. This was also a raceless labor movement, something that other parts of the US was struggling with. Today, Hispanic heritage is deeply embedded in American culture, from language and food to music and traditions. Yet the history of El Norte and the Brown Belt is still not widely taught in schools. Understanding this revolutionary history of El Norte isn't just about recognizing the past, it's about acknowledging the people and cultures that have shaped the United States in ways we often take for granted, important more than ever in the current fascist climate. So next time you hear American history told as a story of English colonies and westward expansion, remember, there was another America before America, and part of that America was a land called El Norte. And at its heart, there appeared the Brown Belt, a labor force that built nations and ignited revolutions while blurring racial lines. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this.